The security guard who dismissed the casually dressed black man as just another cleaning worker had no idea he was speaking to the anonymous benefactor who had been paying for his wife's cancer treatment for the past 8 months. The morning rain had stopped by the time Dr. James Mitchell pulled into the parking garage of St. Catherine's Medical Center, but the gray October sky still cast a subdued light over the sprawling hospital complex. James was not arriving for work. Despite his medical degree and decades of experience as a pediatric oncologist, he had retired from active practice 3 years earlier to focus on his philanthropic work. Today, James was visiting the hospital in his capacity as the anonymous founder of the Mitchell Hope Foundation, a charitable organization that had quietly funded cancer treatments for over 2,000 patients across the country. The foundation operated with complete anonymity, providing financial assistance to families who couldn't afford the astronomical costs of cancer care, but never revealing the identity of their benefactor. James was dressed in faded jeans, a simple gray hoodie, and well-worn sneakers, the casual attire of someone who no longer needed to maintain the professional appearance required of a practicing physician. At 62 years old, James had accumulated a net worth of over $400 million through a combination of medical patents, pharmaceutical investments, and the sale of a revolutionary cancer diagnostic technology he had developed. But James's wealth was not obvious from his appearance. He drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic, wore clothes from department stores, and lived in a modest 3-bedroom house in a middle-class neighborhood. His humility was genuine, rooted in his upbringing as the son of a janitor and a cafeteria worker, who had sacrificed everything to help him become the first person in his family to attend college. James's visit to St. Catherine's today was part of his regular routine of checking on the patients whose treatments his foundation was funding. He never revealed his identity to the families he was helping, but he wanted to ensure that the medical care they were receiving met his exacting standards. As James approached the main entrance of the hospital, carrying a worn canvas messenger bag that contained files on the dozen patients he planned to inquire about, he was intercepted by a security guard who was clearly having a difficult morning. Officer Tony Ramirez was 38 years old and had been working hospital security for 6 years. Tony was normally a friendly and professional employee, but today his stress was visible in his tense posture and distracted demeanor. He had spent the previous evening at his wife Maria's bedside during another round of chemotherapy, and he had gotten only 3 hours of sleep before reporting to work. Maria Ramirez was battling stage 3 breast cancer, a diagnosis that had turned Tony's world upside down 8 months earlier. The treatment protocol recommended by Maria's oncologist was aggressive and expensive, involving cutting-edge immunotherapy drugs that cost $37,000 per month. Tony's insurance through the hospital covered some of the treatment costs, but the family was still responsible for nearly $12,000 per month in out-of-pocket expenses. Tony had depleted their savings, taken out a second mortgage on their house, and was working overtime shifts whenever possible. But the financial strain was overwhelming. What Tony didn't know was that an anonymous donor had been covering the family's cancer treatment costs for the past 8 months through a charitable foundation that operated with complete discretion. The foundation had contacted Maria's billing department directly, arranging to pay all costs not covered by insurance without any publicity or recognition. Tony had been told by the hospital's financial counselor that Maria qualified for charitable assistance from a private foundation, but he had never been given details about the source of this help. Tony assumed it was a large institutional charity or perhaps a government program designed to help families in financial crisis. Tony had never imagined that his family's benefactor might be an individual who chose to help strangers without seeking credit or gratitude for his generosity. Now, as James Mitchell approached the hospital entrance looking like any other visitor in casual clothes, Tony was too distracted by his personal stress to pay careful attention to the interaction that was about to unfold. "Excuse me," Tony said, stepping in front of James as he approached the automatic doors. "Are you here for maintenance or cleaning services?" James paused, understanding immediately that Tony had made an assumption based on his appearance. This wasn't the first time James had been mistaken for a hospital employee rather than a visitor, and he had learned that correcting such misunderstandings often created more awkwardness than simply clarifying his purpose. "I'm here to visit patients." James replied politely. "I have appointments with several families." Tony looked skeptical. James's casual attire and canvas bag didn't match Tony's mental image of someone who would be visiting multiple patients for official business. Tony was also operating on too little sleep and too much stress to process information as carefully as he normally would. "Cleaners and maintenance workers need to check in at the service entrance," Tony said, pointing toward a side entrance marked with signs directing vendors and service personnel. "Main entrance is for patients, families, and medical staff only." James felt the familiar sting of being judged based on his appearance rather than his character or purpose. But he also recognized that Tony's mistake came from established protocols rather than personal malice. James had encountered similar situations countless times over the years, and he had learned that responding with dignity was more effective than responding with indignation. "I understand the confusion," James said calmly, "but I'm not here for maintenance or cleaning. I'm visiting patients as a representative of a charitable foundation." Tony's skepticism deepened. James's appearance still didn't match Tony's expectations for someone representing a charitable organization, and Tony was too tired and stressed to consider that his assumptions might be wrong. "Sir, I need to see some identification and documentation of your appointment," Tony said, his tone becoming more official. "Hospital policy requires all visitors to be properly credentialed." James reached into his messenger bag and pulled out his driver's license and a business card that identified him as a representative of the Mitchell Hope Foundation. The business card was deliberately vague, listing only a phone number and website, without providing details about the foundation's scope or James's role as its founder. Tony examined the identification and business card, but his stress and exhaustion were making it difficult for him to focus on details. The business card looked legitimate, but Tony had never heard of the Mitchell Hope Foundation, and James's casual appearance continued to clash with Tony's assumptions about charitable representatives. "I'm going to need to verify this with administration," Tony said. "You can wait in the lobby while I make some calls." James understood that Tony was following hospital security protocols, but he also recognized that this verification process could take significant time and might expose his identity in ways that would compromise his anonymity. James's philanthropic work depended on his ability to help families without creating publicity or obligations that might make recipients uncomfortable. "That's fine," James said, settling into a chair in the lobby. "I'll wait here while you check with your supervisors." Tony disappeared into the security office, leaving James alone in the hospital lobby, with time to observe the families around him. James saw elderly couples holding hands while waiting for test results, young parents trying to entertain children during long waits, and individuals sitting alone with the worried expressions of people facing medical crises. James had spent decades working in hospitals, but his perspective had changed since he had begun focusing on philanthropic work. Now he saw not just patients and families, but people struggling with the intersection of medical crisis and financial catastrophe. While James waited in the lobby, Tony was in the security office making phone calls to verify James's credentials and purpose. But Tony was also taking breaks from these calls to check on updates about Maria's condition and treatment schedule. Maria was scheduled for her next chemotherapy session the following day, and Tony was coordinating his work schedule to ensure he could be present for the treatment. Tony had never missed one of Maria's chemotherapy appointments, understanding that his presence provided emotional support that was crucial to her ability to endure the difficult treatment process. During one of these personal phone calls, Tony spoke with Maria about her upcoming appointment and the continued stress of managing their medical expenses. "The financial counselor says the foundation is still covering most of our costs," Maria told Tony. "I don't understand how we qualified for so much help, but I'm grateful every day that someone is willing to help families like ours." Tony agreed with Maria's gratitude, but he also felt frustrated by his inability to thank their anonymous benefactor directly. Tony was a proud man who had always been self-sufficient, and accepting charity, even necessary charity, was emotionally difficult for him. "I wish I knew who was helping us," Tony said. "I'd like to thank them properly and maybe find a way to pay them back someday." Maria reminded Tony that their benefactor had chosen to remain anonymous, probably because they wanted to help without creating obligations or expectations. But Tony's desire to express gratitude remained strong, and he often wondered about the person or organization that had saved his family from financial ruin. After 30 minutes of phone calls and verification checks, Tony returned to the lobby where James was still waiting patiently. Tony had confirmed that the Mitchell Hope Foundation was a legitimate charitable organization, and that James Mitchell was authorized to visit patients on the foundation's behalf. But Tony had not learned that James Mitchell was the founder and sole benefactor of the foundation, or that the Mitchell Hope Foundation was currently paying for Maria Ramirez's cancer treatment. "Mr. Mitchell," Tony said, approaching James with a slightly apologetic tone, "I've verified your credentials with administration. You're cleared to visit patients, and I apologize for the delay." James stood up, gathering his messenger bag and preparing to continue with his planned visits. "No apology necessary, you were doing your job." Tony handed James a visitor's badge and provided directions to the elevator bank that would take him to the oncology wing, where most of his foundation's patients were receiving treatment. As James walked toward the elevators, Tony returned to his security station, unaware that he had just apologized to the man who had been saving his family from financial catastrophe for the past 8 months. James, meanwhile, was thinking about Tony's dedication to hospital security protocols and wondering about the personal circumstances that had made Tony seem so stressed and distracted. James had learned to recognize the signs of families under pressure, and he had noticed something in Tony's demeanor that suggested personal struggles beyond normal work stress. When James reached the oncology wing, he checked in with the head nurse and began reviewing the status of patients whose treatments his foundation was funding. James always conducted these visits with careful attention to patient privacy, never revealing his identity or his financial role in their care. James's first visit was with the Martinez family, whose 7-year-old daughter was receiving treatment for acute lymphoblastic leukemia. James introduced himself as a foundation representative, checking on the quality of care and asking if the family had any concerns about their treatment experience. "The care has been wonderful," Mrs. Martinez told James. "We don't know how we would have afforded Anna's treatment without the foundation's help. Whoever is funding this program has saved our daughter's life." James listened to Mrs. Martinez's gratitude with the mixture of satisfaction and humility that had come to define his philanthropic work. He was deeply moved by the knowledge that his financial resources were making life or death differences for families, but he was also aware that his wealth was meaningful only because it could be used to address human suffering. James's second visit was with the Thompson family, whose teenage son was battling bone cancer. Mr. Thompson was a construction worker, whose insurance covered basic treatment, but not the specialized procedures that offered the best chance of saving his son's leg from amputation. "The foundation covering our expenses has given us options we never thought we'd have," Mr. Thompson explained. "My son has a chance to keep his leg and play baseball again because someone was willing to help a family they've never met." As James continued his visits throughout the morning, he heard similar stories of gratitude from families whose lives had been transformed by his anonymous assistance. But James also noted areas where the hospital's patient services could be improved, and he made mental notes about additional support services that his foundation might be able to fund. James's final visit was with the Chen family, whose infant daughter was receiving treatment for a rare genetic condition that required experimental therapy, costing over $100,000 per month. The treatment was showing promising results, but it would need to continue for at least 2 years to give the child the best chance of normal development. "We know the foundation is taking a huge financial risk on our daughter," Mrs. Chen told James. "The treatment is so expensive and there's no guarantee it will work, but someone believed our daughter's life was worth trying to save." James assured Mrs. Chen that the foundation's commitment to her daughter's treatment was absolute, regardless of the cost or uncertainty about outcomes. James had learned that the most important philanthropic decisions were often the ones that involved supporting families through situations where conventional insurance coverage was inadequate. After completing his patient visits, James stopped by the hospital's financial counseling office to review the status of foundation-funded treatments and discuss potential new cases that might benefit from assistance. The financial counselor, Sandra Williams, had worked with the Mitchell Hope Foundation for 3 years and had developed deep respect for their approach to charitable giving. Your foundation has helped over 40 families at this hospital alone, Sandra told James. The Ramirez family is one of our current success stories. Mrs. Ramirez is responding well to treatment, and they've been able to focus on her recovery instead of worrying about finances. James was familiar with Maria Ramirez's case from his foundation's files, but he was hearing her name mentioned in the hospital for the first time. How is the family managing the emotional aspects of treatment? James asked, knowing that financial support was only one component of what families needed during cancer treatment. Mr. Ramirez has been incredibly dedicated, Sandra explained. He's here for every treatment session, and he's been working extra shifts to maintain their family income. The foundation's support has meant that he can focus on being a husband and father instead of taking on debt that would have taken years to repay. James felt a recognition stirring as Sandra described Tony Ramirez's situation. James remembered the stressed security guard from the morning, and he began to wonder if there might be a connection between Tony's distracted demeanor and the family stress that often accompanied cancer treatment. Is Mr. Ramirez one of the hospital employees? James asked carefully. Yes, he works hospital security, Sandra confirmed. He's been here for about 6 years, and everyone respects his professionalism and dedication. James now understood that Tony Ramirez, the security guard who had directed him to the service entrance that morning, was the husband of Maria Ramirez, whose cancer treatment James had been funding for 8 months. The irony was profound and painful. Tony had treated James as if he didn't belong in the main entrance of the hospital, not knowing that James was the person who had made it possible for Tony to focus on his wife's care instead of financial catastrophe. But James also understood that Tony's mistake had come from stress, exhaustion, and security protocols rather than malice or prejudice. Tony was doing his job while managing an impossible personal situation, and James's appearance had fit Tony's mental category for service workers rather than hospital visitors. As James left the hospital that afternoon, he reflected on the complexity of the morning's encounters. He had been misunderstood and misdirected by the man whose family he was helping, but he had also gained insight into Tony's character and dedication. James began to consider whether there might be an appropriate way to help Tony understand the connection between his family's benefactor and the man he had encountered that morning. But James also knew that revealing his identity would need to be done carefully, in a way that honored Tony's dignity and avoided creating embarrassment about the security checkpoint incident. The most important realization for James was that his philanthropic work was creating connections and impacts that extended far beyond the financial transactions recorded in his foundation's files. He was helping families build strength, hope, and resilience during their most difficult challenges. But he was also learning that these families included people like Tony Ramirez, dedicated workers who deserved to understand that their benefactor was not a distant institution, but someone who shared their commitment to family, dignity, and service to others. That evening, James Mitchell sat in his home office reviewing the medical files of the patients his foundation was supporting, but his mind kept returning to the encounter with Tony Ramirez at the hospital security checkpoint. James had experienced countless moments of being misunderstood based on his appearance, but this particular incident felt different because of the personal connection he hadn't known existed. James opened the file for Maria Ramirez, studying the details of her treatment plan and the foundation's financial contributions over the past 8 months. The numbers told the story of a family facing catastrophic medical expenses, monthly treatment costs of $49,000, insurance coverage of $37,000, leaving Tony and Maria responsible for $12,000 per month in out-of-pocket expenses. The Mitchell Hope Foundation had been covering those costs since Maria's second month of treatment, after the hospital's financial counselor had identified the Ramirez family as meeting the foundation's criteria for assistance. James had approved the funding without knowing Tony's name or occupation, focused only on ensuring that financial barriers didn't prevent Maria from receiving the best possible care. Now James understood that Tony Ramirez worked security at the same hospital where Maria was receiving treatment, and that Tony's stress and exhaustion that morning had been the result of balancing a demanding work schedule with the emotional demands of supporting a spouse through cancer treatment. James's phone buzzed with a text message from Dr. Patricia Chen, Maria's oncologist, and one of James's former colleagues from his years practicing medicine. Patricia didn't know about James's role as Maria's anonymous benefactor, but she occasionally updated him on interesting cases when their paths crossed professionally. James, thought you'd be interested to know that Mrs. Ramirez is responding exceptionally well to the immunotherapy protocol. Tumor markers are down 60% from initial diagnosis. Her prognosis has improved dramatically since we were able to start the aggressive treatment plan. Reading this message, James felt the deep satisfaction that had motivated his transition from practicing medicine to philanthropic work. Maria Ramirez was alive and improving because financial barriers had been removed from her access to cutting-edge treatment. But James also felt the weight of knowing that Tony had no idea his wife's recovery was possible because of the man he had redirected to the service entrance that morning. James had established the Mitchell Hope Foundation 8 years earlier, after his wife Sarah's death from pancreatic cancer had taught him about the intersection of medical crisis and financial catastrophe. Sarah had been diagnosed at stage 4, and despite James's medical expertise and substantial financial resources, she had lived only 6 months after diagnosis. During Sarah's final months, James had spent countless hours in hospital waiting rooms and corridors, observing families who were facing not only the terror of life-threatening illness, but also the additional burden of financial ruin. James had watched parents mortgage their homes to pay for children's cancer treatments, elderly couples choosing between medication and groceries, and young families destroying their credit to access experimental therapies. Sarah's death had left James emotionally devastated but also financially positioned to address the problem that had surrounded them during her illness. James had liquidated most of his investment portfolio and used the proceeds to establish a foundation dedicated to removing financial barriers from cancer treatment. If this story is touching your heart, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. The foundation operated with complete anonymity because James had learned that many families were uncomfortable accepting charity, especially when it came from identifiable benefactors who might expect gratitude or recognition. James wanted families to focus on treatment and recovery without feeling obligated to maintain relationships with their financial supporters. James had also chosen to dress and live modestly because he understood that visible wealth often created barriers between himself and the families he wanted to help. When James visited hospitals or met with medical staff, he wanted to be seen as someone who understood ordinary financial pressures, not as a wealthy philanthropist dispensing charity from a position of privilege. This approach had worked well for 8 years, allowing James to help over 2,000 families without creating publicity or social obligations that might compromise the foundation's effectiveness. But James had never before encountered a situation where his anonymity had led to personal misunderstanding with someone whose family he was helping. James pulled up Tony Ramirez's employee file, which he had requested from the hospital's Human Resources Department as part of his routine background checks on foundation recipients. The file revealed that Tony had been working hospital security for 6 years, with consistently excellent performance reviews and no disciplinary issues. Tony's supervisor had written in his most recent evaluation, "Officer Ramirez demonstrates exceptional professionalism and attention to detail. He has never missed a scheduled shift and frequently volunteers for overtime assignments. His dedication to hospital security protocols is exemplary." Reading this evaluation, James understood that Tony's insistence on following security procedures that morning had reflected his commitment to doing his job correctly, not personal prejudice or unprofessional behavior. Tony had been tired and stressed, but he had still attempted to follow hospital protocols for visitor verification. James also learned from Tony's file that he had been working substantial overtime during the past 8 months, exactly the period when Maria's cancer treatment had been ongoing. Tony had been picking up extra shifts to generate additional income for medical expenses that he didn't know were being covered by an anonymous foundation. This information painted a picture of Tony as a man who was working exhausting hours to support his family during a medical crisis, unaware that his financial sacrifice was unnecessary because of help he hadn't known existed. James's reflection was interrupted by another text message, this one from Sandra Williams, the hospital's financial counselor. "Dr. Mitchell, I wanted to follow up on our conversation about the Ramirez family. Mr. Ramirez stopped by my office today asking about ways to express gratitude to the foundation supporting his wife's treatment. He's clearly feeling overwhelmed by the generosity, and I think he would benefit from understanding that his appreciation is recognized even though the donor remains anonymous. James stared at this message for several minutes, understanding that Tony was struggling with the emotional complexity of accepting help from an unknown benefactor. James remembered his own difficulty accepting help during Sarah's illness, the desire to maintain independence and dignity even when circumstances required relying on others. James composed a careful response to Sandra. Please let Mr. Ramirez know that his gratitude is deeply appreciated by the foundation, and that his dedication to his wife's care is exactly the kind of strength that makes families worthy of support. The foundation's anonymity is designed to allow families to focus on recovery without feeling obligated to maintain relationships with donors. But as James sent this message, he realized that his standard approach to anonymity might not be appropriate for Tony's situation. Tony wasn't just any foundation recipient. He was a hospital employee who had encountered James directly, and he was clearly struggling with questions about his benefactor's identity and motivations. James began to consider whether there might be a way to help Tony understand the foundation's support without compromising the privacy that protected other families. James also wondered if Tony deserved to know that his benefactor was someone who understood the demands of hospital work and who respected Tony's professionalism, despite the morning's misunderstanding. Over the following days, James found himself returning to the hospital more frequently than usual, ostensibly to check on various patients but actually hoping to observe Tony at work and gain a better understanding of his character and circumstances. During these visits, James was consistently impressed by Tony's professionalism and attention to detail. Tony greeted every visitor courteously, checked credentials carefully, and maintained security protocols without making people feel unwelcome or inconvenienced. James also noticed that Tony often looked exhausted, but that his fatigue never compromised his job performance. Tony was clearly someone who took his responsibilities seriously, even when personal circumstances were making his life extraordinarily difficult. On his third visit to the hospital that week, James overheard a conversation between Tony and another security officer that provided insight into Tony's perspective on his family's situation. "How's Maria doing with the treatments?" the other officer asked. "She's responding really well," Tony replied. "The doctors are optimistic about her prognosis. We've been incredibly lucky with the financial assistance we've received. I don't know how we would have managed without help from some charitable foundation. Do you know anything about the foundation that's helping you?" "Not really," Tony admitted. "The financial counselor says it's a private foundation that helps cancer patients, but they operate anonymously. I keep wanting to write a thank you letter or find some way to express our gratitude, but there's no way to contact them directly." Tony paused, and James could see the emotion in his expression. "I've never been good at accepting help from other people. I've always been the kind of person who pays his own way and solves his own problems. But this situation is bigger than anything I could handle alone." James felt a deep recognition of Tony's struggle with accepting help. James had experienced similar feelings during Sarah's illness, when he had been forced to rely on other people's expertise and support in ways that challenged his sense of independence and control. Listening to Tony talk about his gratitude and his desire to thank an anonymous benefactor, James began to understand that his standard approach to philanthropy might be creating emotional burden for recipients who needed some form of connection or closure with their supporters. James also realized that Tony's encounter with him at the security checkpoint had been shaped by the stress of managing a situation that was far beyond Tony's control. Tony was working overtime, caring for a spouse with cancer, and accepting charity from an unknown source, circumstances that would challenge anyone's emotional equilibrium. That evening, James called Dr. Patricia Chen to discuss Maria's treatment progress and to gather more information about the family's emotional state during treatment. "Maria is doing remarkably well medically," Patricia told James, "but I've noticed that her husband seems to be under tremendous stress. He's here for every treatment, which is wonderful for Maria's emotional support, but I worry that he's not taking care of himself." Patricia continued, "Tony works security here at the hospital, so I see him during his regular shifts in addition to his visits with Maria. He's clearly exhausted, but he never complains or asks for accommodations. I have tremendous respect for his dedication. James asked Patricia if she thought Tony might benefit from counseling or support services for family members of cancer patients. Probably, Patricia agreed. But Tony strikes me as someone who would be reluctant to ask for help beyond what's absolutely necessary. The financial assistance they've received has been crucial, but I think Tony is still carrying a lot of emotional burden about accepting charity. This conversation confirmed James's growing sense that Tony needed something beyond anonymous financial support. Tony needed to understand that his benefactor was someone who respected his character and who saw the foundation's assistance as an honor rather than charity. James made a decision that would change both his own approach to philanthropy and Tony's understanding of the help his family had been receiving. James was going to find a way to reveal his identity to Tony, but he was going to do it in a manner that honored Tony's dignity and explained the connection between James's support and his respect for Tony's dedication to his family. The challenge would be finding an approach that allowed Tony to understand the personal motivation behind the foundation's support without making Tony feel embarrassed about the security checkpoint incident or obligated to express gratitude beyond what felt natural to him. James spent the weekend developing a plan that would allow him to approach Tony directly, explain his role as the foundation's founder, and help Tony understand that the morning's misunderstanding had actually deepened James's respect for Tony's commitment to his job and his family. The conversation that would follow would be unlike any that James had experienced during his 8 years of anonymous philanthropy. But James was beginning to understand that some situations required personal connection rather than institutional distance. Tony Ramirez deserved to know that his family's benefactor was someone who understood the challenges of hospital work, who respected Tony's professionalism, and who saw Maria's recovery as a shared victory rather than a charitable transaction. 2 weeks after his decision to reveal his identity to Tony Ramirez, James Mitchell returned to St. Catherine's Medical Center with a carefully planned approach for the most important conversation of his philanthropic career. James had spent days considering how to reveal his role as Tony's family's benefactor, without creating embarrassment about their initial encounter or overwhelming Tony with guilt about the security checkpoint incident. James arrived at the hospital during Tony's afternoon shift, wearing the same casual clothes that had led to their misunderstanding 2 weeks earlier. But this time, James was carrying a folder containing documents that would explain everything Tony had been wondering about his family's anonymous benefactor. James approached the security checkpoint where Tony was stationed, and Tony immediately recognized him as the foundation representative who had visited patients several times over the past 2 weeks. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mitchell," Tony said professionally. "Are you here for more patient visits today?" "Actually," James replied, "I was hoping to speak with you personally, if you have a few minutes when your shift ends." Tony looked surprised by this request. "Is there something wrong with the foundation's work at the hospital? I hope my security checks haven't been causing problems for your visits." James could see that Tony was worried about having somehow interfered with the foundation's patient support work, and James realized that Tony was still concerned about potential professional consequences from their initial encounter. "No problems at all," James assured him. "Actually, I wanted to talk with you about something personal. Would you be available to meet privately after your shift, maybe in the hospital cafeteria?" Tony agreed to meet, though his confusion was evident. James spent the remaining hour of Tony's shift visiting other patients and reviewing cases with the medical staff, but his mind was focused on the conversation that would soon reveal 8 months of hidden connections. When Tony's shift ended at 6 o'clock, he found James waiting in a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria, with 2 cups of coffee and the folder of documents that would change Tony's understanding of his family's situation. "Mr. Mitchell," Tony began as he sat down, "I have to say I'm curious about what you wanted to discuss. Is this about my wife's treatment? Has something changed with the foundation's support?" James took a deep breath, realizing that there was no gentle way to ease into the revelation he was about to share. "Tony," James said, using his first name to signal the personal nature of what was about to follow, "what I'm going to tell you is going to be difficult to process, and I want you to know that you can ask me any questions you need to ask." Tony's expression became more serious, and James could see that he was preparing for potentially bad news about Maria's treatment, or the Foundation's continued support. Tony, I am the founder and sole benefactor of the Mitchell Hope Foundation. I have been personally funding your wife's cancer treatment for the past 8 months. The silence that followed this statement lasted for nearly a minute. Tony stared at James with an expression that moved from confusion to shock, to something approaching disbelief. "What did you just say?" Tony whispered. "I'm the person who has been covering Maria's medical expenses," James repeated gently. "The Mitchell Hope Foundation is my foundation. I've been paying for her immunotherapy treatments, her hospital stays, and all the associated costs that weren't covered by your insurance." Tony's face went through a series of emotions as he processed this information. James could see recognition, gratitude, embarrassment, and something that looked like shame, all competing for expression. "You're—" Tony started, then stopped, then started again. "You're the person who saved my family?" "Yes," James confirmed. "And I want you to understand something important. Helping your family has been an honor, not a burden. Maria's recovery is exactly why I established this foundation." Tony was quiet for several minutes, and James could see that he was struggling to reconcile his image of the anonymous institutional benefactor with the reality of the casually dressed man sitting across from him. "Mr. Mitchell," Tony said finally, "I need to apologize to you for something. 2 weeks ago, when you first came to the hospital, I treated you like you were a maintenance worker. I directed you to the service entrance and questioned your credentials. I had no idea." James interrupted Tony before he could continue with his apology. "Tony, you were doing your job. You were following security protocols, and you were dealing with an enormous amount of personal stress. There's nothing to apologize for." "But I was rude to you," Tony insisted. "I made assumptions based on how you were dressed, and I treated you like you didn't belong in the main entrance of the hospital. Meanwhile, you were the person who was saving my wife's life." James leaned forward, looking directly into Tony's eyes. "Tony, I want you to understand something. That morning, you were exhausted because you had been at Maria's bedside the night before during her chemotherapy. You were stressed because you were working overtime to try to pay medical bills that you didn't know were already being covered. You were following hospital security procedures because you take your job seriously." James paused, letting Tony process this perspective. "Your behavior that morning showed me exactly the kind of man you are. Someone who takes care of his family and who does his job with integrity, even when he's under tremendous personal pressure." Tony was crying now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was learning and the complexity of emotions he was experiencing. "I don't understand," Tony said through his tears. "Why would you help us? We're strangers to you. And why didn't you tell us sooner?" James had been prepared for these questions, and he answered them with the honesty that Tony deserved. "I help families because I understand what it's like to watch someone you love fight cancer while you feel helpless to do anything meaningful to help them," James explained. "My wife Sarah died of pancreatic cancer 8 years ago, and during her illness, I saw families destroying themselves financially to pay for treatments that might save their loved ones." James continued, "I established the foundation because I realized that my medical background and my financial resources could remove barriers that prevent families from accessing the best possible care. But I remain anonymous because I want families to focus on recovery and healing, not on feeling grateful to a specific person." Tony was listening intently, but James could see that he was still struggling with the complexity of accepting such extraordinary generosity from someone he had encountered professionally. "Tony," James said, "I want you to know that I didn't reveal my identity to make you feel guilty about our first meeting, or to create an obligation for you to thank me. I revealed my identity because I realized that you were struggling with questions about your benefactor, and I thought you deserved to know that the person helping your family is someone who respects your character and your dedication." Tony looked up at James with an expression of profound gratitude mixed with continuing confusion. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't know how to process this. For 8 months I've been wondering who was helping us and why. I've been working overtime shifts that I didn't need to work, trying to pay bills that were already being paid." "I know," James said gently, And I want you to understand that your willingness to work those extra shifts, even when it wasn't necessary, shows exactly the kind of character that makes families worthy of support." Tony was quiet for several minutes, and James could see that he was trying to understand the full scope of what had been happening in his life without his knowledge. "Can I ask you something?" Tony said finally. "Anything. How much has this cost you? How much money have you spent on my wife's treatment?" James had anticipated this question, and he had decided to answer it honestly. "Your wife's treatment has cost approximately $396,000 over the past 8 months. The foundation has covered the $96,000 that wasn't paid by your insurance." Tony stared at James in shock. "You've spent almost $100,000 on my wife?" "Yes," James confirmed. "And I would spend it again without hesitation. Maria's recovery isn't just about the money. It's about giving families the chance to focus on what matters most during the most difficult period of their lives." Tony was crying again, but now his tears seemed to be a mixture of gratitude, relief, and something that looked like joy. "Mr. Mitchell," Tony said, "I need you to know something. Maria's responding incredibly well to the treatment. The doctors are saying that her prognosis has improved dramatically since she started the immunotherapy. She's going to live because of what you've done." James felt the deep satisfaction that had motivated his transition from practicing medicine to philanthropic work. "That's the only outcome that matters to me, Tony. Everything else is just logistics." Tony looked at James with an expression of profound respect. "Can I ask you why you dress so casually when you visit the hospital? I mean, you have the resources to look like someone who has your kind of wealth." James smiled, appreciating Tony's directness. "I dress this way because I want families and medical staff to see me as someone who understands ordinary financial pressures, not as a wealthy philanthropist who's dispensing charity from a position of privilege. I want to be approachable, not intimidating." Tony nodded, understanding this explanation but also recognizing the irony of his initial reaction to James's appearance. "Mr. Mitchell," Tony said, "I have one more question, and it's the most important one." "What is it?" "What can I do to repay you? Not the money, I know I can't repay that kind of money. But what can I do to show you that your help meant everything to our family?" James had been thinking about this question for weeks, and he had an answer that he hoped would help Tony understand the true nature of their relationship. "Tony, the way you repay me is by continuing to be the kind of husband and father and employee that you've already shown yourself to be. The way you repay me is by helping Maria recover completely, and by building the kind of life together that makes all of this worthwhile." James paused, then added, "And maybe someday, if you encounter someone who needs help that you're capable of providing, you remember that receiving help when you needed it made it possible for you to help someone else when they need it." Tony listened to this answer with an expression of understanding and acceptance. "So this isn't about charity," he said. "This is about people helping people." "Exactly," James confirmed. "This is about recognizing that we're all connected, and that sometimes we're in a position to help, and sometimes we're in a position to need help." Tony extended his hand to James, and they shook hands with the mutual respect of two men who had come to understand each other's character through extraordinary circumstances. "Mr. Mitchell," Tony said, "I want you to know that you've given us more than just medical treatment. You've given us hope, and you've given us the chance to focus on Maria's recovery instead of financial catastrophe. Our family will never be the same because of your generosity." James felt tears in his own eyes as he responded to Tony's gratitude. "Tony, your family's strength during this crisis has reminded me why this work matters. Helping Maria recover has been as meaningful to me as it has been to your family." As they prepared to leave the cafeteria, Tony had one final question for James. "What happens now? Do we continue with the foundation's support or do we transition to working with you directly?" James had prepared for this question as well. "Nothing changes in terms of Maria's treatment support. The foundation will continue covering her costs until she's fully recovered. But now you have my direct contact information, and if you have questions or concerns about her care, you can reach out to me personally." James handed Tony a business card with his personal phone number and email address. "And Tony, I want you and Maria to know that my interest in your family's well-being doesn't end when her treatment is complete. You're part of the Foundation's extended family now." Tony looked at the business card, then back at James. "Does this mean we're going to see you around the hospital more often?" James smiled. "Probably. I visit the hospital regularly to check on Foundation patients. And now that we know each other, I hope those visits will include conversations about how your family is doing." As they walked out of the cafeteria together, Tony asked one more question that revealed his continuing amazement at the day's revelations. "Mr. Mitchell, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "When you came to the hospital 2 weeks ago and I directed you to the service entrance, did you know then that you were paying for my wife's treatment?" James shook his head. "I had no idea. I learned about the connection later that day when I was reviewing Foundation files. That's when I realized that Tony Ramirez, the security guard, was the husband of Maria Ramirez, the cancer patient." Tony stopped walking and looked at James with an expression of amazement. "So when you found out that I had treated you like a maintenance worker, you decided to reveal your identity instead of just staying anonymous?" "Yes," James confirmed. "Because I realized that you deserved to know that your benefactor was someone who understood your dedication to your job and who respected your character, even when you were dealing with impossible stress." Tony was quiet for a moment, then said something that James would remember for the rest of his life. "Mr. Mitchell, you could have stayed anonymous and let me spend the rest of my life wondering about who had helped us. Instead, you chose to trust me with the truth, even though it meant risking that I might feel embarrassed about our first meeting. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." As they reached the hospital's main entrance, Tony turned to James one final time. "Thank you," Tony said simply. "Not just for the money, although that saved our family. Thank you for treating us with dignity and for helping me understand that accepting help when you need it doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." James felt overwhelmed by Tony's gratitude and his insight into the deeper meaning of their connection. "Thank you, Tony," James replied, "for showing me that the most important part of helping people isn't the financial support. It's the relationships and the understanding that grow from shared commitment to family and recovery." As James walked to his car, he realized that his encounter with Tony Ramirez had taught him something fundamental about philanthropy that 8 years of anonymous giving hadn't revealed. Sometimes the most important gift you can give someone isn't money, but the knowledge that they're understood and respected by the person who's helping them. Tony's recovery from the shock of learning his benefactor's identity would take time, but James was confident that their relationship would become a model for the kind of personal connection that could enhance rather than complicate charitable giving. Most importantly, Maria Ramirez would continue to receive the best possible care, while both her husband and her benefactor focused on the only outcome that truly mattered, her complete recovery and her family's return to the normal life that cancer had temporarily disrupted. 3 months after James Mitchell revealed his identity to Tony Ramirez, Maria Ramirez was sitting in Dr. Patricia Chen's office, receiving the news that would transform her family's understanding of survival, hope, and the power of human connection. "Maria," Dr. Chen said, looking at the latest test results with a smile that had become increasingly common during Maria's recent appointments, "I have extraordinary news. Your latest scans show no detectable cancer cells. You are officially in complete remission." Maria stared at Dr. Chen in disbelief, then looked at Tony, who was sitting beside her holding her hand with tears already streaming down his face. "Complete remission?" Maria whispered. "Does that mean—" "It means the cancer is gone," Dr. Chen confirmed. "The immunotherapy protocol has been completely successful. Your body has responded better than we dared to hope when we started treatment 11 months ago." Maria began crying with relief and joy, while Tony pulled her into an embrace that expressed 11 months of fear, hope, and love. Dr. Chen gave them several minutes to process this news before continuing with the practical details of Maria's ongoing care. "We'll continue monitoring you with regular scans and blood work for the next 5 years, Dr. Chen explained. "But your prognosis is excellent. The treatment you received has given you the best possible chance of long-term survival." As Maria and Tony left Dr. Chen's office that afternoon, Tony was thinking about James Mitchell and the conversation he needed to have with the man who had made this moment possible. Over the past 3 months, Tony and James had developed a friendship that had grown from their initial revelation in the hospital cafeteria. James had continued visiting the hospital regularly, and his conversations with Tony had evolved from formal updates about Maria's treatment to genuine personal connection about family, work, and life. Maria had met James several weeks earlier, when Tony had finally felt ready to introduce his wife to their anonymous benefactor. The meeting had been emotional for all three of them, but especially for Maria, who had been able to express her gratitude directly to the person who had saved her life. "Mr. Mitchell," Maria had said during that first meeting, "I need you to know that you didn't just pay for my medical treatment. You gave me the chance to watch my children grow up. You gave Tony and me the chance to grow old together." James had been deeply moved by Maria's gratitude, but he had also been struck by her strength and dignity throughout her cancer battle. Maria had endured 11 months of aggressive treatment with grace and determination, never complaining about the physical difficulties or emotional challenges of fighting a life-threatening illness. Now, as Tony prepared to call James with the news of Maria's remission, he was thinking about how to express gratitude for something that transcended financial support and entered the realm of life-changing transformation. James answered Tony's call on the first ring, recognizing Tony's number and hoping for positive news about Maria's latest test results. "James," Tony said, his voice filled with emotion, "Maria is in complete remission. The cancer is gone." The silence that followed lasted for nearly 30 seconds as James processed the magnitude of what Tony had just told him. "Complete remission?" James asked, wanting to make sure he had understood correctly. "Complete remission," Tony confirmed. "Dr. Chen says the treatment was completely successful. Maria is going to live, James. She's going to live because of what you did." James felt overwhelmed by a combination of joy, relief, and profound satisfaction. Maria Ramirez's recovery represented everything James had hoped to accomplish when he had established the Mitchell Hope Foundation 8 years earlier. "Tony," James said, his own voice filled with emotion, "this is the best news I've received since I started the foundation. Maria's recovery is a victory for your entire family." Tony asked if James would be willing to meet with him and Maria that evening to celebrate this milestone and to discuss something important that Tony had been thinking about for weeks. James agreed immediately, and they arranged to meet at a restaurant near the hospital where Maria had received her life-saving treatment. When James arrived at the restaurant, he found Tony and Maria waiting for him with expressions of joy that he had never seen during their previous meetings. Maria looked healthier and more vibrant than she had appeared during any of their conversations at the hospital. "James," Maria said, standing to embrace him, "I can't believe this day has finally come. 11 months ago, we thought I was going to die. Tonight, we're celebrating the fact that I'm going to live." James was deeply moved by Maria's transformation and by the visible relief in Tony's posture and expression. The stress and exhaustion that had marked Tony's appearance during James's early visits to the hospital had been replaced by something that looked like peace and hope. As they sat down for dinner, Tony told James that he had something important to discuss, something that Maria had been encouraging him to pursue for several weeks. "James," Tony began, "Maria's recovery has made us think a lot about what we want to do with the rest of our lives. We've been given this incredible gift, not just the gift of Maria's health, but the gift of understanding how much difference one person can make in other people's lives." Tony paused, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "We want to find a way to help other families who are facing what we faced. We want to be part of the solution for people who are dealing with medical crises and financial catastrophe." Maria joined the conversation, explaining that she and Tony had been discussing ways to contribute to the Mitchell Hope Foundation's work, even though their financial resources were limited compared to James's ability to fund major medical expenses. "We know we can't write checks for $100,000 treatments," Maria said, "but we want to help families navigate the emotional and practical challenges of dealing with cancer treatment." Tony had developed a specific proposal that he had been refining for weeks. "James, I want to become a volunteer coordinator for the foundation. I want to help newly diagnosed families understand their options, connect them with resources, and provide the kind of support that would have been helpful to us during the early months of Maria's treatment. James listened to this proposal with growing excitement, recognizing that Tony's idea addressed a gap in the foundation's services that James had been aware of but hadn't known how to fill. "Tony, that's a brilliant idea," James responded. "The foundation has always focused on financial support, but you're right that families need guidance and emotional support that goes beyond paying for treatment." Maria had her own contribution to suggest. "I want to start a support group for women who are undergoing cancer treatment. I want to share what I learned about maintaining hope and strength during the most difficult months of treatment." James was amazed by Tony and Maria's desire to transform their experience of receiving help into an opportunity to help others. Their proposal represented exactly the kind of community building that James had always hoped his foundation work might inspire. "I want both of you to know," James said, "that your offer to join the foundation's work is one of the most meaningful things that has happened since I started this organization. You understand the challenges that families face in ways that I never could, despite my medical background." Over the following weeks, Tony and Maria began developing their volunteer programs with James's enthusiastic support. Tony started meeting with newly diagnosed families to help them understand treatment options and navigate hospital systems. Maria began facilitating support groups for women undergoing cancer treatment. Both programs were immediately successful, with families expressing gratitude for the peer support that Tony and Maria provided. Tony's experience as a hospital employee gave him credibility with families who were intimidated by medical environments, while Maria's recent recovery gave her authority with patients who were struggling to maintain hope during difficult treatments. If this story moved you, don't stop here. Click the next one, subscribe, and share this with someone who still believes in kindness. 6 months after Maria's remission, the Mitchell Hope Foundation held its first annual celebration dinner, an event designed to bring together families who had been helped by the foundation and volunteers who had contributed to its work. James had never before organized a public event connected to his philanthropic work, but Tony and Maria had convinced him that families wanted the opportunity to meet each other and share their stories of recovery and hope. The dinner was held in the ballroom of a hotel near St. Catherine's Medical Center, and over 200 people attended: patients, family members, medical staff, and volunteers who had all been touched by the foundation's work. James gave a speech that evening that captured his evolution from anonymous philanthropist to community builder. 8 years ago, I established the Mitchell Hope Foundation because I believed that financial barriers should never prevent families from accessing the best possible medical care, James told the audience. But tonight I understand that this foundation has become something much more important than a charitable organization that pays medical bills. James continued, "Tonight I see families who have not only survived medical crises, but who have chosen to help other families facing similar challenges. I see volunteers who understand that the most powerful form of support comes from people who have experienced the same fears and hopes that accompany a cancer diagnosis." James looked directly at Tony and Maria as he spoke his next words. "I see proof that the best charitable work creates communities of people who support each other, rather than simply creating relationships between benefactors and recipients." The audience gave James a standing ovation, but he was looking at Tony and Maria, who were crying with pride and gratitude as they listened to James acknowledge their contributions to the foundation's expanded mission. After James's speech, Tony was invited to speak about his experience as a foundation volunteer coordinator. Tony had never spoken publicly before, but his words that evening captured the heart of what the foundation had become. 11 months ago, my wife was diagnosed with cancer, and I thought our world was ending, Tony told the audience. I was working overtime shifts to try to pay medical bills that I couldn't afford, and I was watching the woman I love fight for her life. Tony paused, looking at Maria, who was sitting in the front row with tears in her eyes. What I didn't know was that someone was already helping us. James Mitchell was paying for Maria's treatment, but he was doing it anonymously because he wanted our family to focus on recovery rather than gratitude. Tony's voice grew stronger as he continued. But James taught me something even more important than the value of financial generosity. He taught me that the best way to honor help that you've received is to find ways to help other people when they need it. Tony looked directly at James as he spoke his final words. James saved my wife's life, but he also showed me that we're all connected, and that sometimes we're in a position to help and sometimes we're in a position to need help. The foundation works because it understands that helping people isn't about charity. It's about community. The audience gave Tony a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. James was crying as he listened to Tony articulate the philosophy that had guided his philanthropic work, but that he had never been able to express as clearly as Tony had just done. After the dinner, as guests were saying their goodbyes, Tony approached James for a private conversation that would conclude their year-long journey from misunderstanding to partnership. "James," Tony said, "I need to tell you something that I've been thinking about since the night you revealed your identity to me." "What is it?" James asked. "That morning when I directed you to the service entrance, I made a mistake about who you were based on how you looked," Tony said. "But you made a choice about who I was based on how I acted under pressure. You saw past my stress and exhaustion to understand my character and my dedication to my family." Tony paused, then continued. "You could have stayed anonymous and let me spend my life wondering about who had helped us. Instead, you chose to reveal your identity because you thought I deserved to know that my benefactor was someone who understood and respected me." Tony extended his hand to James, and they shook hands with the mutual respect that had grown from their extraordinary circumstances. "That choice you made," Tony said, "taught me more about leadership and generosity than any amount of money could have taught me. You didn't just save Maria's life. You showed me what it means to see the best in people, even when they're not at their best." James felt overwhelmed by Tony's insight and gratitude. "Tony, you and Maria have taught me that the most important part of helping people isn't the financial support. It's the relationships in the community that grow from shared commitment to supporting each other." As they prepared to part that evening, James had one final observation about their year-long journey from misunderstanding to partnership. "Tony, when I first established this foundation, I thought the most important thing I could do was remain anonymous and simply pay for treatments that families couldn't afford," James said. "But you and Maria have shown me that the most meaningful charitable work creates lasting connections between people who understand each other's struggles and who choose to support each other through difficult times." James paused, then added, "Our relationship has taught me that real generosity isn't about giving money from a distance. It's about building community with people who share your values and your commitment to helping others." 2 years later, the Mitchell Hope Foundation had expanded to include peer support programs, volunteer coordination services, and community building initiatives that connected cancer survivors with newly diagnosed families. Tony had become the foundation's volunteer coordinator, while Maria had established support groups at 5 hospitals across the region. James continued to fund medical treatments for families facing financial barriers to cancer care, but his role had evolved from anonymous benefactor to community leader who understood that lasting change required personal relationships rather than institutional charity. The foundation's success was measured not only by the number of families receiving financial support, but by the number of cancer survivors who had chosen to become volunteers, the number of medical professionals who had joined the foundation's advisory board, and the number of communities that had adopted the foundation's model of peer support and community building. On the 3rd anniversary of Maria's remission, James, Tony, and Maria returned to St. Catherine's Medical Center for a special ceremony recognizing the hospital's partnership with the Mitchell Hope Foundation. During the ceremony, James was asked to speak about the evolution of his philanthropic work. 3 years ago, James told the audience of medical staff and foundation supporters, "I came to this hospital as an anonymous foundation representative, dressed casually and carrying a messenger bag. A security guard named Tony Ramirez directed me to the service entrance because he thought I was a maintenance worker." James looked at Tony, who was sitting in the front row with Maria, both of them smiling at the memory of their first encounter. What Tony didn't know was that I was the person who had been paying for his wife's cancer treatment. What I didn't know was that Tony was exactly the kind of person who deserved not just financial support, but the opportunity to understand that his benefactor respected his character and his dedication to his family. James continued, That misunderstanding led to the most important conversation of my philanthropic career, and to a friendship that has transformed both the Foundation's work and my understanding of what it means to help people effectively. James concluded his speech with words that captured everything he had learned from Tony and Maria about the true nature of generosity and community. Real charity isn't about wealthy people helping poor people. Real charity is about people who understand each other's struggles, choosing to support each other through difficult times. Real charity creates communities where everyone has something to contribute, whether it's financial resources, personal experience, emotional support, or simply the willingness to show up for other people when they need help. As the ceremony concluded, James realized that his encounter with Tony Ramirez had taught him the most important lesson of his adult life, that the most meaningful relationships are often built from the most unlikely beginnings, and that the best charitable work creates lasting connections that benefit everyone involved. Tony's initial mistake about James's identity had led to a friendship that had enriched both their lives and had transformed the Foundation's approach to helping families facing medical crises. James's decision to reveal his identity had created a partnership that had expanded the Foundation's impact far beyond what financial support alone could have accomplished. Most importantly, Maria Ramirez's complete recovery had proved that the best charitable work doesn't just solve immediate problems. It creates opportunities for people to transform their experiences of receiving help into commitment to helping others facing similar challenges. The security guard who had said "cleaners this way" had become the volunteer coordinator who helped hundreds of families navigate cancer treatment. The anonymous benefactor who had funded a stranger's medical care had become the community leader who understood that lasting change required personal relationships built on mutual respect and shared values. Real gold isn't something you display to impress other people. Real gold is the trust that allows someone to reveal their identity, to help another person understand that they're valued and respected. Real gold is the generosity that transforms receiving help into the commitment to help others. Real gold is the recognition that we're all connected, and that the best charitable work creates communities where everyone has something valuable to contribute.